Hello, First Baptist. It's Marissa, and I'm back to talk to you about one of the most universally beloved components of the Bible. Its genealogies and lists of names. In Nehemiah chapter 7, Nehemiah tells us that the walls have been completed and the gates have been hung. And after 52 weeks of labor and trials and political intrigue, you would think that there would be a great climactic celebration in the city. But instead, we get the worst kind of letdown as Nehemiah launches into a census. If you want to have fun with your community group this Sunday, ask them what the most boring part of the Bible is. The correct answer is, of course, the first 9 chapters of First Chronicles. Read it and you'll know I'm right. But after your class gives their answer, you can make them feel guilty by quoting 2 Timothy 3:16, which tells us that all scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training, which means, yes, even those long lists of names. So what does this list have to teach us? Or if these names seem irrelevant to us today, how were they relevant to the Israelites of Nehemiah's day? Nehemiah's list of exiles is the first of 4 lists in Scripture that we'll look at really quickly in this video, and I promise I'll make it quick because the average American can only listen to about 4 ancient Near Eastern names in a sequence before tuning them out. In verse 5, Nehemiah writes, "So my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles, the officials, and the common people for registration by families. I found the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return, and this is what I found written there." The first thing that would stick out to an Israelite listener is the phrase, "So my God put it into my heart." This was not an undertaking that Nehemiah began on a whim or for any selfish reason. He wants those reading his memoirs to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that his intentions were God-given. Because as soon as officials began counting heads, the people would have remembered another census, documented in First Chronicles 21, that didn't end so well. 565 years before Nehemiah rebuilt the wall, King David decided to take a military census. But the account of David's census begins like this. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, "Go and count Israel from Beersheba to Dan and bring a report to me so I can know their number." David wanted to count his people like Ebenezer Scrooge counted his gold. Counting his people spoke to David's possessive pride and also to his insecurity. God had promised to preserve David's kingdom, but Satan tempted him by speaking to his anxiety and his fear. Taking the census was an indication that David didn't trust God to keep his promises. Because of the wicked intent at the root of David's census, a plague came down onto the people of Israel. 70,000 people fell. So you can see why Nehemiah felt it was necessary to reassure the people that his motives for counting the people came from God. In Ezra chapter 2, we find a list of all the exiles who had returned to Jerusalem. David had counted all men who could draw a sword, but Ezra counted all those whose hearts God had moved. David's census had been a sign that his faith in God was lacking, but Ezra compiled his list as a testament to God's faithfulness. And it's this list that Nehemiah is talking about in Nehemiah chapter 7, the genealogical record of those who had been the first to return. Each name is a testament to the faithful promises of God in blessing Abraham. The Israelites would have recognized one other important fact, that David repented of his lack of faith and received God's forgiveness by building an altar on the threshing floor of Ornan, and it was at this site 1,600 years earlier where Abraham built an altar with his son Isaac. Before building the altar there was again a census of sorts that was taken, but it was much easier to digest as there were only 2 names listed. Genesis 22 says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah.'" 2 men, a father and son, standing as testaments to God's promise. Verses 13 through 18 tells the rest of the story. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." So on the surface, Nehemiah chapter 7 seems like an unnecessarily boring lull in the action, but as it turns out, it contains a really beautiful message. God was reminding his people that he was faithful to the covenant, that like with David, he would forgive their sins, that like with Abraham, he would provide all that they needed, that God would be the source of their victory, and that they each existed as a testament to God's ongoing covenant that began at Abraham's altar, continued through David on the threshing floor, rested with the remnant at Ezra's temple, and remained still with those who were gathered to hear the Torah within the rebuilt walls of Jerusalem. In this list of names, God was telling his people, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." The similarities between these four accounts also suggest to the people of God that there is a relationship between altar building and Torah reading, in which sacrifice and the law complement one another as avenues of God's presence and conduits of his grace. Which, just FYI, there is another list of names that you can find in Matthew chapter 1, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, God's ultimate conduit of his grace and the culmination of God's covenant promises. Be blessed, and we'll see you on Sunday.